Я Людмила Ружанская. Сейчас мы попросим Андрей Александрович.
Спасибо.
Unmute your
And I think Andrei, your microphone is muted as well.
Really?
Yeah, I mean.
Раздел Александровича Яковлева тоже презентером. Андрей Яковлев.
Ага. Александр, вы, может быть, можете как-то управлять звуком участников?
Да, я сам сделал.
Okay, so.
Ага, да, все теперь хорошо.
Okay, so fine. Hi, Tomek, again.
Hello.
Okay, so I think we can start in 1-2 minutes, yeah?
Well, yes, whenever is good for you, yes.
Okay, fine.
I've seen, you know, it was in UK news. I've seen that the was it UK news or anyway, I've seen it somewhere. You know, apparently the weather in Moscow has been fantastic. You had like 20
today,
degrees.
Yeah, it's quite warm, yeah, really, yeah.
You know, they were showing pictures.
Really very cold spring, yeah, because only 1 week ago or 10 days ago it was a lot of snow in the streets. Mm-hmm. But now it's really very warm.
But in
no, they were showing pictures in t-shirts, you know, going around.
No, for today, yes, yeah. But 10 days ago it was a lot of snow, yeah. A bit strange weather.
It's very late spring this year.
So let's hope the cold will not come back, or
yeah.
But we are waiting snow at the main vacation, maybe between 1st or 9th of May. We are waiting for snow again.
And when is Easter? I know that Easter will be
2nd
of May.
Yeah.
So let's hope it does not fall on Easter. Yeah. No.
Okay, so colleagues, I think maybe we should start already, yeah? Or...
Okay, I would need to share the screen. Let me just try to do it.
Tomek, I think I should say some words about you at the beginning, yeah?
Okay. So I'll keep silent.
Yeah. First of all, I'm really very grateful to you that you accepted our invitation. So, and no, in some sense, you are old friend of me and of HSC too. I think we met first time maybe in mid-2000s or something like that, or maybe even earlier, during your work at University College London with School of Slavonic, East European, Slavonic and East European Studies, yeah. So, but as I know before, you worked even in public administration in Lublin as deputy mayor and so on, yeah. And after that, you joined academic career, yeah. So, and in 2008 or in 2012, yeah, in 2012, you joined Aston Business School, yes?
Yes, 2012, yes, almost 10 years.
Yeah, already. So, and Tomasz Mickiewicz is really one of very strong scholars, both in comparative economics and management, with some focus on transition economies. Also, Tomasz had a number of papers based on empirical analysis of Russian data about small and medium-sized enterprises, about privatized firms, and so on. So he served also as president of European Association for Comparative Economic Studies. And actually, this keynote lecture is a joint event of HSC and EASIS. So again, I'm really very glad to see you and welcome you. So it's very unfortunate that we could not invite you personally due to all this situation with pandemic and so on. But I hope that you will visit us again, because you was already before, yeah. And maybe not only Moscow, but also Ekaterinburg, because we are organizing exactly this section with our colleagues from Ural Federal University. So, okay. maybe it will be enough as some kind of introduction. And the topic of your keynote lecture is Firms, Markets and Institutions, Alternative Theoretical Framework. Yeah. So, Ludmila, would you add something on your side?
I would add only that maybe something about the scientific or research interests of Professor Mickiewicz. Maybe I would like to add concerning the several research interests, for example, comparative entrepreneurship, regional entrepreneurship, high growth aspiration entrepreneurship, and social capital, trust, the informal economy, and of course, institutional economics. And so we are waiting for today's presentation concerning the institutional economics. And the topic of this presentation will be strongly connected with the title of our section. And it seems to me we will have a very fruitful discussion. And I ask for all participants of this presentation preparing the question for Professor Mickiewicz, and I'm kindly ask for Professor start his presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ludmila. Thank you, Andrei. Very kind words. Now the first thing I will try to share content. If you just bear with me a second, and then I need to choose the slides. And can you see the content now?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay,
it's
fantastic.
First slide.
Thank you very much. I will apologize if I'm looking slightly off the screen because it's just the screen are organized. It's projecting on another screen. But before I start, thank you very much for both of you for your very kind words. I remember my visit at Higher School of Economics very well, and it's a beautiful part of Moscow as well, and also what I know very well from your work. I mean, colleagues from more than one colleagues from higher school is this topic is of interest. I mean, I remember the conference, I remember other papers you wrote, and we share a lot of joint interest. I'll start presenting in a second, but if anybody will have any questions, please, I welcome questions during my talk, and also, of course, after we may have questions. So the topic of today is Firms, Markets and Institutions, Alternative Theoretical Framework. I thought instead of I wanted to take a step back, and basically what I would like to do is to discuss the way we think about institutions in both business and economics. And a lot of what we apply in our papers is extension of organizational theory. There is a natural link because institutions can be taken as a sort of organization at a higher level. So that link is quite natural, but it also has some limitation, which I would like to point out. And there are some important choices that are being made, and there is more than one answer to some of those questions, or more than one aspect is being emphasized. So I will focus on those differences. And why the most general point I would like to make is why those differences are important is simply because the language we use matters. When the language we use limits what we can describe and therefore what we can see clearly. And by constructing the language which is more precise and more adequately describes reality, we are able to see much better things that otherwise remain kind of blurred. So the plan for this is I will talk about theories. I will start with transaction cost economics, which I'm pretty sure is by now common knowledge. but still I need that as a starting point. I'll move to what has become known as institutional voids. I will talk about market supporting institutions. I will talk about institutional competition. Then move to the concept of hierarchy of institutions, sociological institutionalism, and finally I would try to argue what I think we are missing in some of this analysis. What are the limitations of those approaches? So this is part one. I will start with transaction costs. And this is Ronald Coase. And basically the theory we are discussing goes back to the question he asked in 1937 when he was a graduate from LSE. And the question was, of course, why firms exist, why individual firms exist, why we are not having just a nexus of contracts which could substitute for a given firm. And this is why he came with the notion of transaction costs. He basically said that different organization challenges can be answered by more than one mode of organization, and firms and markets are alternative ways of organizing similar transactions. And then we had Oliver Williamson, who went into more detail, different attributes of transaction, and then leading to different optimum models of business organization. Again, either firms, markets, or quite a lot in between, a lot of hybrid organizations. And basically, the fundamental idea behind all this analysis I would like to stress is the idea of efficiency. This is how transaction cost links with the core economics, because the core economics, at least traditional economics, is based on the concept of efficiency. The relation between inputs and outputs applied to many issues. So the efficiencies here generalized because we talk about efficient ways of organizing some special problems. And then neither Coase nor Williamson did talk about institutions. Even if the funny thing is that the most famous book by Williamson is called The Economic Institutions of Capitalism, except that this is not a book about institutions. He talks about organizations. But then more recently, that link has been explicitly recognized, and the classic book, which is used to this day by many people, is Paul Milgrom, who was given Nobel Prize recently, and John Roberts, Economics, Organization and Management. And basically, when you open the book, they start actually with parallel with examples of institutions and examples of organizations, and they showed some direct parallels between the two. And they use, and on the opening of the book, they use the example which is well known for somebody like myself who was born under a communist system, and likewise yourself, which is basically they described the Soviet type communist central planning. And then parallel to that, they have an example of trade monopolies from going traced back to 18th centuries. I'm not going to refer their work. I'm just saying that this notion of efficiency is what links the two together in this approach, the institutions and the organizations. So then we have a modern variant of this analysis, which is especially popular in business literature and management literature. And this is what became known as institutional voids. And that probably the most prominent authors who started this approach was Khanna and Palepu. And they basically explicitly based on transaction cost perspective. This is the foundation of their work, and effectively the voids or missing institutions are those that fail to support various markets, exchanges by firms, individuals, and or else. So and now their special interest in their work is that of foreign investors. So institutional void's perspective became applied for all questions around foreign direct investment, and the question is then asked from the point of view of foreign investors: what are the missing institutions that, and therefore what are the inefficient markets they encounter where they wish to invest. But again, this was extended to entrepreneurship. You could ask the same question from the perspective of entrepreneurs who are domestic players. But the one important shift already in these theories, which is often not explicitly recognized, is we are actually moving to something else. Because for Milgram and Roberts, the way they apply transaction costs was, the question was about the overall efficiency of the economic system. So there was implicitly, there was some concept of overall welfare, of maximizing some overall welfare. Is it possible or not? I will leave aside because this is another interesting question. But nevertheless, this perspective has been implicit. If you think about the whole economy, we are assuming that the notion of efficiency can be extended from the firm to the economy, and then the economy can be analyzed from the point of view of how efficient it is. Now, what is the subtle difference then? The difference with institutional voids is that we now do not see the question from the point of view of the overall economic system. We see it from the angle of foreign direct investors, or say from the angle of entrepreneurs or some other category of economic players. So we are exchanging one perspective from another, what is more economic perspective to what is more business perspective and more fragmented perspective. Now we were talking here about market supporting institutions. This is what effectively Kana and Palepo would tell us. But then more recently, we have a paper in top international business journal by Cuervo, Kazura, Gore, and Singh, all of them very recognized people. And they basically say that there is no such a thing as voids, because countries rarely lack institutions. Some do. If we think about some failed places, even Somalia is not a good example anymore, but you know, Somalia some time ago was kind of basket case of failed state where there was simply very little institutionalization. But most countries, practically almost all of them, have institutions. They're not lacking institutions, they're not missing institutions. So the notion of void, they say, is not quite representing a best language to describe it, because if you think some extreme example like of oppressive system, like for example North Korea, it's not the case that North Korea has no institutions. It's not. It's simply that it's those institutions in terms of the capacity of government to exercise power are quite strong in some aspects. Some other aspects they may not be strong, but then they are not pro-market. They are not pro-market. So simply they argue that institutional voids should be simply replaced by market supporting institutions. This is their position. So we shouldn't be talking about institutional voids, we should be talking about market supporting institutions. But now that leads to another question and another issue. This is the exact, on the slide I have exact citation from the paper by Cuervo, Kazura and his colleagues. And basically now they recognize the problem themselves. The problem is basically that, again, when we have institutional voids, we're looking at the problems from the point of view of investors. And the problem is that some managers may well prefer situations of low level of pro-market institutions. And much of Andrei work is like this, basically recognizing that it's not the case simply that foreign investors or say managers of large domestic enterprises will be necessary in case of pro-market institutions. They want to realize some rents, and those rents may not be best realized under market conditions. So there is a slight problem. There is a slight problem because we are merging two perspectives. We are confusing two perspectives. One is the overall perspective of efficiency. The other one is what is good for specific businesses or for even all businesses. So then the criterion of reducing transaction costs is becoming more nuanced because we always need to ask for whom we want to reduce transaction costs. We just cannot avoid this question. Now, if we forget about this question, we are ready to make a simplification, then the next step they make is basically, and this is a step made in quite a lot of empirical literature nowadays, is basically that the stronger the markets, the better. The stronger the markets. So the question of supporting markets is simply the question. Then becomes a question of creating more and more space for markets. So effectively, they say that implicitly, pro-market institutions are rules and regulations that facilitate market transactions and limit the role of the government in the economy. So now the interesting thing is here is the joining together and compressing together those two parts of this statement. So is facilitating market transaction the same thing as limiting the role of the government in the economy? This is an interesting question. So Milgram and Roberts, again, their starting point in their seminal book was analyzing the Soviet system, and as we all knew it, older of us, and then saying that less government regulation means stronger markets. And this is actually, and in a way, this is what brought economic growth. If you look at the most recent, it's not on the slide, but if you look at the most recent issue of Journal of Comparative Economics, again, there is an article which basically does empirical estimations and again show you that discrete jumps in indicators of economic freedom were responsible for periods of growth after the economic transition, after the Soviet system imploded. So, but the problem is how far we go, because it's not that difficult to agree that Soviet system there was too little markets. There's very little people who would agree, for example, that North Korea is a model to follow. At least I do not know anybody like this. So when you start with the Soviet type economy, then it's not difficult to agree that you need more market. But does it mean you go all the way around? Does it mean that if you look at the economic freedom indicators, is it correct to assume that Ireland or a few others who are top of the scale, New Zealand, Australia are simply what we should approach, or what would make the economic system more efficient? So again, the question may be a little bit more complex. It's locally, it's a different thing to say that locally, starting from the concrete local position, we need more markets, and a different thing to say that we always need more markets. The second is much more ambitious proposition, and it's more difficult to defend. So what is the foundation of this view, which seems to be now more and increasingly present in, at least in business literature, but also, as I gave you an example from Journal of Comparative Economics, you see that in economics as well. So the implicit assumption is that public choice private interest theory, because private interest can take over public interest, and this happens a lot in government, then effectively effective markets are those when the government is constrained, limited, and rule-bound. So this is, again, what becomes operationalized by economic freedom indices. You have those 10 or now 12 dimensions, I think, where basically along different dimensions, labor law, trade regulations, and so on, you have basically scales which are linear scales. So they only have 2 dimensions. So now, effectively, again, when you look closely into detail, what you see is that more economic freedom is simply becoming more like Ireland, New Zealand, or Australia, because those are the top countries on those scales. So I just leave this question as open. I don't give you any answers, but I just leave you this question as open. Are we going to adopt this kind of view that more markets means more efficient system and less government means more efficient system? Or is there a scope for variety? Now, the second aspect, which is problematic in this literature, is basically the focus on regulation. So again, there is a distinction, a very clear-cut distinction between regulation and higher, what we typically call in our work, higher order institutions, or other people call them political institutions. It's the same thing, because once you move to the constitutional level, we are talking about political institutions. So it's just a language, but the phenomenon is the same. So either you have, of course, business literature, and quite a lot of that, which would consider features of political systems, and that question has been around and is addressed. But somehow this literature is disjoint. So the literature on economic freedom would be disjoint from the literature on the political institutions. So once we focus on regulation, we may take 3 positions, and they are different positions. We may either say that political institutions are irrelevant. So then the example would be something like Singapore, which is of course high on economic freedom, but somewhere in the middle range of political institutions. Not terribly oppressive, but it's not also doesn't have a free political system. So this is one option. You just say that political institutions are irrelevant, or you say they are affecting regulation, or you may say that they are affecting economic outcomes directly. And basically, to make it clear, I just put it on the graph. So we are interested in some business and economic outcomes. We are interested in the notion of efficiency. Again, could be differently defined, as I argued. But then we take 3 different positions. Either what matters is the link between regulation to business and economic outcomes. It may be second option is that political institutions affect regulation and therefore they matter indirectly for business outcomes. Or we have a position where we take political institutions to affect business and economic outcomes directly. Before I try to follow with this question a little bit further, I wanted to make a digression, because so far all this assumed that we basically treat countries as units, while there is this important stream in the literature on institutions, which basically focus on within country variations. And basically we have the largest countries, and they of course include Russia, China, India, Germany, US, which have meaningful variation simply either because they are large, and then will apply to all of them, or because they are sufficiently decentralized, and then we can dispute if some of them are sufficiently decentralized, including Russia. But the key fact is that there is enough institutional variation within those countries. If there is enough institutional variation, then we have some interesting effects which are below country level, because basically we may have more competition. This is the most important argument. This is the literature. We have more competition, and that competition may take various forms, but the most direct forms is just food voting. So as long as there is enough freedom of movement, companies, people will move around, and that ultimately will create some pressure for delivering at the local level, at the regional level. So this is the key argument. And of course, also typically accountability is easier when you have local level becomes important. But thirdly, and also quite important argument, relates to experimentation. And this is the lesson that China understood quite well when they were in the period of reforms, which is late 1980s and with some break 1990s. So because basically experimentation at the local level is less risky. So even from the point of view of enlightened autocrat, it actually makes sense to decentralize, because experiments at the country level are risky and they may have unpleasant consequences for the authorities. But allowing for local experiments simply comes with less risk, and then you can learn some lessons and then apply this elsewhere. So here the argument is that this is why I made this digression, because the federalist outcomes and are then achieved without strong political institutions, by which I would mean primarily without the rule of law, without strong rule of law. So in a way, the competition mechanism under this argument may substitute for universal low transaction costs rules. So effectively, we have a variant of what I discussed before, where this is not just political institutions, but it's a sub-country characteristics of the institutional system that will matter, and they not necessarily need to be connected. Again, because, and the primary example has been given, was in that context was China. So now let me go to before this part, and then I'll come to the conclusions. This part I wanted to go back to this question of hierarchy of institutions, where we have constitutional institution on the top, regulation slightly lower, and what to make of it. So Cuervo Casura is cited, one of the most prominent people working on institutions and business nowadays. Countries, what he says is, I'm just repeating this quote: countries rarely lack institutions, they rarely have voids. But is it the case? I just left this question open a few slides back. So one take is that once we look at the regulation, we take quality of institutions as a separate dimension, an important dimension. So it's not just the content of the regulations, it's the effectiveness and orientation of the government in implementing those regulations. So the immediate lesson from it is that the limitation of institutional transparent, because regulations that may be quite effective under efficient bureaucracy may be a disaster once implemented somewhere else, where the quality of the administration is not that high. And that discussion was going on, for example, in terms of banking regulations following the latest financial crisis 10 years ago, over 10 years ago. The discussion has, it's fine to have stringent banking regulation in countries which have effective administration, but then if you try to do the same one fit all, then it may create more problems that it solves. So the core assumption here is that the quality of government will somehow have different sources than efficient design of regulation. it would be seen as a separate factor. And this is the view that Fukuyama is promoting, for example, in some of his books, especially the political order books. His 2 books about political order. He basically gives example of Prussia, which created efficient bureaucracy, even if the political characteristics were not that of the modern countries which are considered politically free. So so they can be separated. At least this is what Fukuyama will tell us. Maybe yes, maybe not. I'm just again leaving you with this question. Now, there is the quality of government is there is a lot of data, not on the country level, but again that links with federalism. We have more and more data on sub-country level, and this is for the European Union. This is thanks to the quality of the government project by Bo Rothstein and his colleague from Gothenburg. So when you try to understand what they mean by quality of the government, actually you go back to the concept of rule of law. If you read Bo Rothstein, he basically says that explicitly. So the government which is impartial is simply a government which is characterized by the rule of law, and the other side of the coin, what their main contribution, I would think, is that they understand quite well what is the other side of the coin. So when they talk about the rule of law, they immediately talk as well about corruption, cronyism, favorism. So effectively, they understand that those are the 2 sides of the same coin. Either you have one or you have another, because corruption is nothing else but people being treated not in the same way, which breaks the fundamental assumption of the rule of law. So those are 2 sides of the same coin, and there is country variation. Again, there is sub-country variation. There are studies that link this sub-country variation to history, and so on. And generally, weak institutional quality and weak rule of law, by definition, almost assumes that there is more within country variation, because again, this uniformity, universality of rules is being broken, so that leaves much more space for variation. If you are in one place, you may expect from the government something different than from another place. So from one point of view, this is a pessimistic conclusion. From the other point of view, this is an optimistic conclusion, because it goes back to the issue of the question of federalism. Because it can be worse, but it also can be better. More will be simply depending on local conditions. So you have a quality of government, again, either as a separate factor or as mediating in the impact of regulation. This is where we are now. So mediating because regulation will be implemented by a given bureaucracy and maybe implemented more and less efficiently. So again, we have this distinction between different institutional levels, and which may call constitutional level, political institutions, and then the level of regulation. And the higher level is actually very close to the notion of institutional quality. Williamson, incidentally, whom I cited at the beginning, if you look at his most classic paper on this, which was 2000 paper in Journal of Economic Literature on new institutional economics, he doesn't have this distinguish. He doesn't distinguish those 2 levels clearly at all. The scholar who does is Ostrom. It is in her work you see this distinction made clearly. And again, you have applied work which simply tests some of those effects, and you have the cross-level institutional effects between rule of law or call it quality of government and regulation. Some of it is by my colleagues Jonathan Levy and Erko Autio. Now, so here we have a slightly different perspective because we are adding one more option, which is option 4 on this graph, which is effectively that once we have the hierarchy of institutions, what we are assuming that the higher order institutions would create framework, would create boundary conditions for what can be done on the lower level. So in that way, they become a factor affecting regulation. So regulation is no longer taken as completely autonomous as that it is also affected by the higher order institutions. So again, what I wanted to stress is, because this is not an obvious conclusion, especially if you look at the empirical work, the way it is implemented is that the quality of government and the rule of law, I'm just repeating myself, is very close. Because the rule of law is the fundamental basis is basically equal concern and respect for everybody. And once you take that, you simply see that all the negative phenomena such as corruption, clientelism, nepotism, cronyism, patronage, state capture, they are simply breaking those conditions of equal concern. But there is one more complication here, because seen this way, those are outcome variables. Both the rule of law, which is how the institutions are exercised in practice, actual practice, and related phenomena, they are outcome variables. They are outcome variables. We are looking at the outcome. So we are risking some circularity here. Some circularity, because we are just describing, but we are not explaining yet. Now, so this is why it is useful to look at the institutional conditions for the rule of law. And again, the most influential work I'm aware in this line of research would be the Acemoglu and Johnson article 2005 in Journal of Political Economy, which they called unbundling institutions. And basically they were looking at contracting institutions. They were looking at what I called higher order institutions, and especially the empirical indicator of executive constraints or effective constraints on the executive power of the government, of the executive branch of the government. Are there any constraints, and how effective they are on what the executive branch of the government can do? And of course, those constraints are typically with the judicial system, which is independent and basically can limit somehow the executive branch of the government. What they documented in their work was that simply this condition actually is important for economic outcomes, and they are also important for specific business outcomes. We documented that for entrepreneurship. Bies and Mueller documented that for FDI, and so on. So why this is an interesting empirical angle? Because we are moving from what we observe as the outcomes to some of the deeper institutional conditions which make those outcomes possible. So what we have now is just spelling out this square in the left-hand upper corner, which is what is now becomes a central element under this approach in higher order institutions are the institutional conditions for the rule of law, and those conditions are simply on constraints imposed, effective constraints imposed on the executive branch of the government. And that affects, and then you have various combinations how they lead to business outcomes, either directly or indirectly, or as a moderating effects or mediating effect through regulation. You have all those possibilities. Now, this is not the end. I'm closer to the end now, I promise, but this is not yet everything I would like to discuss, because what I completely left aside so far, and what is left aside in much of this literature, are what people call informal institutions. I mean, it's not that people like Williamson were not aware of it. Williamson talks about embeddedness. If you look Douglas North, he also was not blind to it. The most cited author on institutional economics, Douglas North, his 1990 book or article 1991, most cited work on economics ever, institutional economics ever. He's actually aware in the book that the problem is that none of them has much to say about it. They just leave it aside. And this is, again, the author who is not like this is Ostrom, because Ostrom is talking about meta institutions. And then again, if you look at the work by legal scholars, by Dworkin, for example, taking rights seriously, again, he will understand that the same way as contracts are not complete, the law is never complete. So this is just one system which is kind of hierarchical, going from most general to most specific. So most specific is regulation, then you have the constitutional constraints, and then before that you have some shared norms, and those norms are simply cultural norms. They are not norms which are explicitly, they may be, some of them, they may be translated into more specific rules, but they are not spelled out. They are simply fundamental propositions on which the Dworkin argument will be that Ronald Dworkin, his argument would be that effectively times we need to go back all the way to those basic propositions, those basic shared assumptions, because otherwise we cannot solve the problem which results from incompleteness of law. But this perspective, again, is rarely visible in economics and business literature. Rarely you see this, despite people simply do not read Ostrom, and even less people would read Dworkin among economists or business researchers. Again, there is a sociological approach. I will leave it aside. And basically, what we have here is that hierarchy becomes even more complex, because we have, and now I compressed formal institutions, all those two levels into one, but now we have meta institutions that Ostrom will call it coming before that, and this is a uniform system. They cannot be the full meaning, the full understanding of regulation, constitutional rules is impossible without going back all the way to those fundamental propositions. So now I'm close to finish. So what I don't want, and I am simply unable to give you all the answers, but I wanted to, my intention was to raise some questions more than anything else. So I believe that new institutional economics does not have all those answers yet. There are still issues that are unresolved, and I would think it would benefit more from reading law theory and people who in some ways are more serious about institutions. Now, what tends to happen, and you see that clearly in Douglas North definition, which is most popular, is that this kind of compression of institutions to the economic question. So of course, the notion of efficiency is what makes economics such a powerful tool of analysis and policy analysis as well, but it has its limitation. Institutions are more than a design to make economic transactions efficient, which North seems to be saying, at least in this citation. And this implicit reductionism of institutions to the economy is an issue. So the question, again, my question is, should the role of institutions be reduced and can it be reduced to optimizing the production process? Scott, sociologist analysis, I left it aside, will tell you no. But they don't really have an alternative answer because what it is, it becomes a functionalist analysis, which is interesting in itself, but it doesn't give you answers. It doesn't answer why. It just tells you about complementarities. If you have institution A, you have institution B. And this is what you also see, for example, in much of variation of capitalism literature. So it's almost if institutions had some mysterious life of their own. So it's almost like Hegelian perspective. And all we can see is to understand how different elements of institutions can be aligned or inconsistent with each other, inconsistent for some historical reasons. But that's not the only answer. If you read Amartya Sen, you'll find another answer. Amartya Sen would tell you that basically that development, the question of development, which is the core question of economics, is not just a question of economic optimizing, because economic optimizing is not all we are interested in. And therefore, economists should not forget, should not accept this kind of reduced perspective, because that's not the, or at least they should remember it's not a complete perspective. So the development for Sen is basically development where people are offered choices, but also they are capable to make those choices. They have competence, they have resources to make those choices. So it's not just a question of choices. So it's not just a question of more economic freedom. It's also a question of conditions that make those choices meaningful. So people understand what the choices are, and they are capable to exercise those choices in reality, not just in abstract. So that one immediate consequence of Sen perspective, and this is, I was citing to 1999 is his Development and Freedom, 2000 is his book Idea of Justice, and they are, it's a more formal book, but you see then they are more clearly. The one implication of that is that process matters as much as outcome. And this is again an idea which is alien to most economists. If you look at plenty of brilliant mathematical papers that are published, and I say brilliant without irony, you know, they often start, let's assume a central planner who is making a decision X, Y, Z, or equivalently a market equilibrium, general equilibrium mechanism. A lot of those papers are written this way. Why? Because they do not have a space in their theorizing for process. Why process is important? Because process is a process of learning. If we think about development as developing humans, then we develop by making choices, by understanding what are the conditions for our choice, by gathering knowledge we need to make those choices, and we enhance our decision-making powers. And this is itself development. And this is basically what is missed altogether, because more often than not, the economist would assume that there is, at the end, and there is an efficient solution on the end, and how that efficient solution was achieved does not matter. And of course, this is dangerous, and we can even think about history and understand why this kind of thinking may lead to serious disasters. So we are simply have to develop our capacities to make decisions. This is part of development. And this is what means also that perspective, what Sen is really doing in his work is going beyond the economic questions, and he tries to understand a few things about anthropology. He tries to think what makes us human, and what basically, so the economic development in his perspective becomes human development. And again, human development is about acquiring capacities for making choices, for making rational choices, and having resources to make those choices unconstrained. And basically, I will finish now with this nice picture of human cooperation, which is basically the best illustration of institutions I can find.
Okay, Tomek, thank you very much for a very interesting overview. Yeah, I would stress that for me, especially your point about the focus of observation is important. You stressed, I think, in the beginning of your lecture, that the question for whom is quite important for individual entrepreneur, for firm or corporation, or for society, and we can get quite different answers depending on this focus. Yeah, but I myself would ask you about one additional, no, maybe not dimension, but some kind of level of institutions. And it is about business associations or industrial associations. Yeah, because on one hand, of course, there are some kind of private clubs defending, first of all, the interests of entrepreneurs. Yeah. But at the same time, it was a number of interesting papers, especially by Donner and Schneider in early 2000s, showing that especially in emerging markets under imperfect institutions and so on, such private clubs can produce public goods and operate as market supporting and market supplementing institutions and so on. What can you say about this phenomena, and how can you incorporate these institutions in these broad pictures described by you just now?
I think this is, thank you, Andrei. I think this is a very good extension of what I was talking about. And your question is quite difficult. I mean, first, I agree with you. Yes, I missed that meso level altogether because I was focusing on the federalism, all this. But I, of course, you know, I still have to find a way to integrate that back to this. Maybe it's impossible to integrate everything because it's almost like a different stream of my. You know, I'm not making such contributions and those you mentioned, but still I did few things on social capital and trust, and it is a very important topic, and the combination of cooperation and competition between businesses is a very interesting topic. How they compete on one place and how they cooperate on another place, and there is another. So I do not really have an answer for you. I just can give you one other example where that was a book which won an award a few years ago, which is called Capitalism from Below by Nie and Opper, where basically they followed in coastal China, they followed several thousand of Chinese businesses, and what they basically detected was emergence of business norms outside the judicial system because nobody there uses courts because nobody believes in courts effectively. But they are still important social sanctions. And the main sanction is simply you stop trading with people. And a lot of that is about cooperation. And because they are small exporters, that makes this kind of economic structure also makes the cooperation easier because they are not competing on they are competing on the local market for resources, but the main way they compete is on the external markets, and the external market is so wide that they don't really it's not a zero-sum game. I'm very sympathetic to this perspective, but I don't really have anything clever to say. You know, it's you know, again, you can use it to criticize economists again, basically, because the standard criticism was that I was making this critical point different way, because I was stressing cultural norms and values as part of the institutional system, but the classical criticism of economists is that this is under socialized perspective, and that was Granevetter wrote it a long time ago when he was in debate with Williamson. And what you are saying is another way to, and you know, there is always this interesting parallel between the perspective on norms, values, and propositions, and the perspective on structures. And this is one of the most interesting and most difficult issues to tackle in economic sociology. And what I was stressing the perspective of norms, values, and structure. But you may say I'm not far away from economic sociology because they are embedded somewhere. Social values do not have, again, life of their own, or social propositions or social norms. You can find equivalent who are the carriers of and who are ready to take them seriously. So even in my perspective, there was structure. But I mean, in social capital, you have trust and you have network capital, and they are almost two sides of the network capital understood as a public good, not as my personal network capital, but something in the environment. Then it becomes quite close to trust. How dense are the connections and how easy it is to establish a connection. But this is a structural aspect, and there is a normative aspect, and it's difficult but not impossible to align those two.
But maybe one more, no, I don't know, is it a question or maybe even comment? Yeah. No, in any case, I really very appreciate your multidisciplinary approach. Yeah. And you are fully right that it's necessary to look at all these problems, not only from a point of view of economics or management, but from broader perspective. Yeah, it's fine for me. Second point, I understand that you are talking actually about agenda. It is not about some kind of final clear theories and so on.
Yes,
and so on.
exactly.
And again, it is fine for me. Yeah, I'm fully agree. Yeah, that we need to discuss these things. Yeah, but maybe as some kind of continuation of the discussion. You told in the beginning, yeah, about these classical works of Coase, Williamson, and so on and so on, about two main coordination mechanisms, yeah, price or hierarchy, yeah. But in reality, in my opinion, we have at least third one with some kind of cooperation between independent actors in the market. Yeah?
Yes.
And for instance, story about business associations, yeah, it is only one example. Yeah?
Yes.
Because, for instance, if we will talk about these industrial clusters in North Italy, yeah,
yes. Yes.
It was done without formal associations, yeah, but it was about cooperation. Yeah? And in my opinion, maybe we could talk about some kind of development during the time, about some kind of evolution, yeah. Because I think practically every time we have in reality some kind of mix of competition and cooperation. If we are talking about economic actors, yeah, I'm talking now not about government, but exactly about firms or entrepreneurs and so on and so on. But in my opinion, a cooperation is much more demanded and actually became more typical for more advanced forms of organization of economy and society. And maybe if we, especially if you maybe could talk a bit about some kind of evolution of all the systems, it would be really quite interesting. Because again, I agree practically with all things told by you, yeah? but maybe this dynamic dimension would be interesting. And maybe one more point. Again, maybe not just now, but maybe for the future, about technology. Because I think technology and new technologies is a very important factor and very important part of development. Yeah. But again, depending on the level of technologies, we will need totally different types of interactions between firms. For instance, if we are talking about modern global value chains, yeah, very often it's not very clear where are real borders of firms. Because all these actors, and formally they're independent, yeah, they are some kind of separate legal entities and so on and so on, located in different countries under different regulatory regime and so on and so on. But they're integrated very strongly with quite high level of trust and also with a quite high level of cooperation.
May I add some words concerning your statement, Andrei?
Yeah, of course.
Because it seems to me the creation of business association connected not only with the technology or maybe level of development of society, because just now during the crisis situation we can see the spontaneously created business associations. It seems to me in the situation of crisis, not in situation of growth of economy, company tries to organize additional supportment from their previous competitors, and they try to organize some quasi-society, quasi-associations, business associations for overcoming the crisis situation. Maybe it depends, maybe this situation in the environment of economy try to create additional circumstances for creating such informal institution.
No, actually, I talked about associations only as one of example, no more, because in reality, this point about cooperation, yeah, in different forms, is much broader. Yeah. Okay.
I think there are very interesting points in what both of you commented. I mean, starting with what Lyudmila was talking about, I think we even applied for funds, but they didn't give it to us, unfortunately. The pandemic situation is a very interesting one because you have indeed, this is a crisis, and then in response to crisis, you have some forms of those cooperation emerging. I'm just elaborating on your example, and the other thing there is which is of interest to me is this concept of transferability of social capital. So social capital from one domain may be transferred to another domain. So often social capital outside the economy can be transferred into the economy. And the large family structure is a simple example. It was Northern Italy from Andrei example. I mean, the classic argument is Northern Italy has larger family structure than Southern Italy, so it naturally led to more extensive contacts, and that was good news. But the same thing you see, for example, in COVID, where the business companies may play an important role borrowing organization to address some other problems, like those caused by pandemics. And of course, you will see the more clearly where I have a colleague who works actually on Somalia. This is why it comes back to, an example comes back to my mind. And the business organizations, they are terribly important because companies are important because they may be the only actor who is effectively there, the only institutional actor in some of those circumstances. But then they can play some additional roles as well and borrow, I mean, they can build reputation, borrow, and so on. So the question of transferability, I just agree with this. I mean, I didn't, in the lecture, I just had to simplify things a little bit. And of course, it's not just price and hierarchy. This cooperation is, and this tension and complex structure between competition and cooperation, I very much sympathize with this perspective. Only thing I would say is, taking an entrepreneurship hat, then the interesting question becomes the one of openness. The one of openness. So basically, you know, you may be in southern Italy, and you may have cooperation, but that cooperation, at one point of view, may turn out to be a mafia-type structure as well. So, and this is about controlling access to some lines of trade, to some ways of earning money, and so on, so on. So the system becomes closed, and you know, I mean, the Acemoglu and Johnson, in their most recent book, they are struggling with the same question. There is how some of those systems became closed and therefore strangled development. They are talking, for example, they have Venice. They have this chapter in their new book, 2019 book, Narrow Corridor, when they say how Venice became a museum. And they say they are talking about this oligarchization of what was once very efficient business organization, became closed and became more a device to extract rents instead of engine of development. So the question of openness is the critical one, and this is, I mean, Fukuyama was touching on this point. Was he right or wrong with his historical examples and country example? I'm not sure, but the idea, I think, was right. He was talking about Japan and Japanese family being able to adopt people, flexibility, adopting people from not based on genetics and blood links, but adopting people to the family and making the system flexible. You know, so it goes to any hierarchical structure when you think about it. When the structure is sufficiently open, it will cause less damage. When it becomes closed, it will cause more damage, because then there is a temptation, then they will focus on extracting rents instead of cooperation. So I think the question of openness, but it's more difficult to address because in a way it's a dynamic question. It's easier to ask people, for example, who they know and with whom they cooperate, when to follow things over a period of time and then understand if the structure is open.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question again about different theoretical perspectives and so on and so on. What do you think about these approaches developed in framework of this theory of varieties of capitalism, including with coordinated market economies, liberal market economies, and also some recent development of this strand of literature with some kind of point of state-permitted market economies, dependent market economies for Eastern Europe, and so on and so on. Or is it already, in your point of view, about some kind of political science literature? And it is not very relevant.
I don't dismiss it, and there are some. I was using some of those insights, you know, from teaching to research, and some of their insights about about labor markets are absolutely classic. That, you know, if you are in between, that's the worst possible situation. If you have either completely decentralized or, and some of the complementarities they identify are very interesting. But I think to me the strongest part of this is not the typology, is the element where they try to understand those functionalities and those complementarities between institutions. And I think there are some very strong insight. About the typology, I'm a little bit more skeptical, because I think it's just too sensitive to, it's just evolving. And some of the key variables, I mean, if you take Britain, for example, and you try to capture the level of government spending, it would oscillate so widely over the last 30 years. You know, is it the same country? Was it the same country from this point of view, from the point of view system? There are some of those are simplifications. In Britain, for example, you had, again, it's evolving, and it changed for worse after Brexit, because it became more close. But even a few years ago, nobody would be questioned if you wanted medical service. Nobody would be questioned if you are, what is your status? You will just be given access. And then you compare with France, which is supposed to be kind of more. So again, this comes to the question you emphasized as well, which is for whom? For whom? The irony about some of those what they kind of welfare socially friendly system, the irony is that they're not really that inclusive. They're outsiders, and those outsiders are easy to not to notice, but they're there. So I think there are some very good insights, but I mean, and those typologies can be detected, of course. There's a different model in Scandinavia, for example, like flex security, for example. The Scandinavian model is certainly different. The Southern Europe is different. The new EU member states are different. You can see that in data, in terms of level of regulation, in terms of the level of government spending. Those are not the same dimensions. You see those differences. But it's kind of, it's the main problem to me is just fluid. 5 years from now, we'll have to change our classifications because something will happen in country XYZ, and then suddenly it becomes So from that point of view, something which takes strongly exogenous perspective, like legal origin, has some advantage because at least we are anchoring it further, and it has some explanatory power. It's not destiny, as legal origin people will say. The legal origin is not destiny, but it still has an impact. Just from looking at I'm always trying to look at this as, you are empirical people yourself as well. So I'm always trying to see theory in relation to empirics. Mm-hmm. And for empirics, you need some exogenous variables. You need some, there's this risk of functionalism I was talking about. That, you see things are complementary, but you cannot explain where they came from. Or what will make them change, which is another variant of that question.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question. Again, coming back to this, your point about this question for whom, yeah? For instance, if we will talk about the interests of corporations or communities, local communities, regional communities, and so on, especially taking into account some recent developments with ecology, some kind of climate changes, and so on and so on, it looks that different regulatory regime, yeah, will provide different outcomes for firms and, for instance, for these communities or societies, yeah. And from this point of view, now, for instance, what can we say about final outcomes? Because some kind of classical theory, yeah, assumed that there is firm, and firm entrepreneur is thinking about profit. But now, in my opinion, we are moving to some kind of new situation with much broader list of parameters which should be taken into account. And in my opinion, very often ordinary firm and even large firm, yeah, simply cannot do it. It can be done only via different type of regulation and so on and so on.
Yeah, yes. I think this is, I mean, both of us are interested in corporate governance, and this is a fascinating question. How how the position of modern corporation evolves, and I would actually link some of that back to cultural norms, because if we just to pick up the what Ingelhardt called post-materialism, I think some explanation of what is going on now is basically that, you know, most of people in Europe are no longer hungry. Basically, you know, it's the main challenge is not to survive. The main challenge is, and then the perspective changes. Simply that the customer changed a lot. If we would go back 100 years ago, the Europe was a desperate place, and you know, people were hungry. 2 years ago, even worse. Fortunately, it's not like this anymore, and that makes people pay far more attention to issues that they didn't pay attention. I mean, of course, if you are hungry, I mean, it's a standard. It's links with development theories as well. Those kind of that, you know, there's a level of development where people start to think about more than just economy. It's not a new idea, but I think this is happening, and then it's a question of last 20, 30 years. A company can be so in such a strong way. So what I'm trying to say is not regulation is there, I agree, but it's also social pressure. And this is a new factor over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, the company can be almost destroyed overnight if it does something that the consumers do not like. And, you know, it can be anything. It can be basically using cotton from slave labor. It can be or child labor, or in another place, or for example, again, dumping some waste, damaging the environment. Things like this, people when they were poorer, they simply didn't care about, and they do care about now. And this will, I don't think it will go away. And that forces companies to simply pay attention, because companies, at the end of the day, a lot of them are very opportunistic. I mean, when they can cheat, they cheat. I mean, take the Dieselgate, for example. Mm-hmm. You know, you wouldn't expect that. This is one of the most reputable car producers in the world, European, with long tradition. And you know, the extent of cheating was just spectacular, and they were not the only one. So when they have a chance, the same way, it's increased accountability. It's increased accountability, and the consumers, they are making choices. This is important for them, so they make choices. Of course, that leads to the next question, which is that public opinion may be manipulated, and you have those games of. This is not a new. I encourage my business students to watch. There's an interesting movie about 19th century America, which is called Current War. I think this is the title, and this is basically the Edison, Tesla, some other inventors in late 19th century America. But the point is, the interesting part of the story is simply how was the Westinghouse Electric, I think, how Edison tries to destroy the reputation of his competitors. So, you know, we are talking about a lot now about black publicity and so on, and I think this is already happening or is coming, where you have, this is kind of dark side of this problem, that you know, some of the corporate gains are about destroying reputations of the competitors. But again, this is not new. It's just that there are new tools being used.
Yeah. So.
Okay, can I ask there a little but empirical question? I would like to ask you concerning the which push factor could be the main one concerning the rising freedom of decision-making process from the side of society. If we want to create the specific circumstances for rising the freedom, common freedom, we will faced with the problem of collective action, with the problem of balance between the desire from one man and collective action from the society at whole, and how we can create the effective motivation of society, how we can create the specific conditions for effective collective actions.
I think the traditional answer, which I agree, is education. That is a major factor in development. But what people often do not, again, take into account, that education does not only have direct impact in terms of higher productivity, it also has impact on increasing the quality of societal level decisions. And this is, I think, the core question. So the educated societies not only are better, have higher productivity directly in the production process, but also because they make better collective decisions. Or, I mean, we have the whole range. Even in more authoritarian scenarios, they still will limit. Typically, education comes with limiting some of the negative outcomes. Less is possible on the downside in more educated societies. So, but the question, it's not the full answer. The reason it's not a full answer is because the world, of course, is becoming very complicated, and the educational system everywhere, or most places, does not really prepare people that kind of ignore this. So, for example, if we believe that climate change is real and is making impact, we should teach children to understand, to make an informed choices about what is going on. If we believe that, and again, this is just one example, but there is more than that. But what I'm trying to say, I think there is an argument and of course there is an argument about the educational system that prepare people for debate and objective evaluation of a problem, even on the higher level. And this is, I mean, there's a lot of things I could criticize about the country I'm living in now, which is United Kingdom, but there are a few things I like. And I observed that with my son. Basically, you have clear stress on debate. So, for example, there is a history lesson. You are given multiple sources. They are in conflict with each other. And then your task is to evaluate, spend week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks evaluating those sources and trying to work out what to make out of it. So those capacities for analysis, independent analysis, because even if we teach them about the problems which are critical now, like maybe climate change, there may be another problem in 10 years' time. There may be something else. So this capacity, and then there is a very interesting book published recently, which is called The Range by David Epstein. And the book is effectively an argument about against narrow specialization on different planes, on the plane of business, on the planes of research, on the planes of making predictions. And one of the interesting chapters is about people who proved most successful in predicting some social political outcomes, like what may happen, what are the risks that may happen in the next few years. and their method of collecting information, detaching from their own biases, trying to make the analysis as objective as possible, discussing and so on. So I think there is much small scope in education for teaching those skills, basically.
Okay.
Thank
So,
you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tomek, yeah, for this discussion. I'm sorry for, unfortunately, not too large audience. We had some kind of transfer during last 2 weeks from Zoom to MS Teams, yeah, and unfortunately it limited in some sense our audience. But in any case, the recording of your lecture will be available at YouTube, and we try to promote it also for our students and so on. So
it was a pleasure. I know you have a tight schedule, and thanks very much for inviting me. And as always, it's very nice to talk to you. And congratulations on a very interesting conference. I mean, the competition was strong, so and people cannot listen to videos all day. That's clear.
But now there is a translation in a YouTube channel, and it's recording, and it could be available after this lecture and during this time, but without the access for this discussion. They can only listen and see.
yeah.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure as always, and hope to see you in person.
Yeah, I hope to do it. Yeah, surely. Yeah, maybe both
Thank
in
you. Hope to see you
UK
again.
or in Russia. Yeah. So,
До свидания.
okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Bye.
Спасибо.
Спасибо всем. Александр, мы завершаем в таком случае. Там следующая ссылка, видимо, уже на следующее мероприятие, да, ведь?
Мне уже нужно уходить. Всем спасибо.
Хорошо, спасибо, коллеги.
Спасибо большое. Всего доброго.